So we are now going to move on to Raine McLeod, who's from Canada. Raine is a former English coordinator for WDI Canada, founder of Alberta Radical Feminists, and she's going to talk about the title of her talk is Government-Funded Defamation, How the Canadian Government is Silencing Feminists. So welcome, Raine, and over to you.
A brief history. In 2015, Justin Trudeau was elected the Prime Minister of Canada. He proclaims himself to be a feminist, and in 2015, he appointed a cabinet that was 50% female. So he was questioned about why he thought it was important to have that parity, and he said, it's 2015. Since his election, he and his party, as well as the other left-ish parties in Canada, have worked to improve the rights of LGBTQ2 plus IA, whatever, Canadians, starting with essentially the catastrophic Bill C-16 that was passed and implemented in 2017. That bill, if you're not familiar, put gender and gender identity and gender expression into the criminal code as protected characteristics. What this did is basically guarantee that self-ID will be obeyed and women can't do anything about it. This has resulted in men being housed in women's prisons, violent sexual offenders, pedophiles, rapists in women's prisons. And it has resulted in women being kicked out of rape shelters and halfway houses. It has resulted in the sexual assault of women in prison. It has involved, now there are men that can have free access to any room that they want with women in it, including change rooms. And any woman who speaks out about this is accused of bigotry or Nazism or what have you. So if you are interested in the men in women's prison issue, Heather Mason did a talk with WDI, I think last year. She's an incredible women's prison advocate. And so it was on April 3rd. She did a Feminist Question Time. She also spoke with Ghislaine Gendron for WD Canada in Quebec on March 6, 2022. Both of these videos are available on YouTube. Some of the other bills that the Liberal government and the other leftish parties have put forward so there was a hate crime bill that was proposed that allows individuals to report people for hate speech in advance of their having committed offense. The bill says, and I quote, "A person may, with the Attorney General's consent, lay an information before a provincial court judge if the person fears on reasonable grounds that another person will commit an offense motivated by bias, prejudice, or hate based on race, national or ethnic origin, language, color, religion, sex, age, mental or physical disability, sexual orientation, gender identity or expression, or any other similar factor." So if a woman or a group of women are planning a feminist rally, it could be reported in advance of having it happen as hate crime, should this bill pass. There was a hate symbol bill that amends our criminal code to outlaw, quote, "everyone who willfully or recklessly promotes or incites hatred or violence against any identifiable group by publicly displaying, selling, or offering for sale a symbol, emblem, flag, or uniform that identifies or associated with a person or organization that promotes or incites or has promoted or incited hatred or violence against an identifiable group." These bills are usually couched in racism and in terms of there being Nazis and KKK and Confederate flags, I think, are included. Yeah, the Confederate flags are included, but it also specifies that the groups that could be targeted on protected characteristics include gender identity or expression. So should someone decide that the suffrage flag is a symbol of hate, that could be outlawed and we could face time in prison. I mean, this is obviously, hopefully hyperbolic, but who really knows? There were people who spoke out against Bill C-16, including Hilla Kerner from Vancouver Rape Relief and Megan Murphy. Gad Saad spoke out about it. Jordan Peterson spoke out about it. The concern was that Bill C-16 was going to allow men into women's spaces, and it has, that it will be compelled, that Jordan Peterson's point was that it was going to compel speech, which it basically has. It's exhausting. So the reason why I am speaking today, in 2020, I and some friends started Away. It was started to support women who needed it. And we raised money for charity. We donated almost 100 handmade female-centered care packages that had food, hygiene kits, including soap and menstrual supplies and the like. We donated more than 60 pounds of clothing to a shelter for distribution to their clients. We participated in rallies supporting free expression as is protected under the Canadian Charter. And we protested men in women's prisons. In August of 2021, on August 19th, a government-funded nonprofit organization that was founded in 2018 published a piece that defamed me and other women who fight for those charter-protected sex-based rights of women and girls. This group is called the Canadian Anti-Hate Network, or CAN. According to their website, CAN counters, monitors, and exposes hate promoting movements, groups, and individuals in Canada using every reasonable, legal, and ethical tool at our disposal. What they really do is write piece after piece maligning Canadian feminists as TERFs, transphobes, racists, Islamophobes for criticizing the restrictions placed on Muslim women by men. We are accused of being right-wing or far-right. We are accused of being members of hate groups. I personally have been referred to as deliberately cruel, hateful, and someone who mocks, bullies, and denigrates the existence of trans women, and someone who is working to ensure public spaces don't include transgender people. This is obviously false. They implied that I was a racist, that I was an ableist and a eugenicist via proximity to the statues of the famous five during the protest in June, and accuse all of us of co-opting feminism. On their Twitter account, CAN frequently share and retweet things that whimsically disparage women as TERFs, which we all know is a gendered slur, and absurdly claim that feminists deny the existence of trans persons. So we do not. The reason why they are related to the Canadian government silencing feminists is that in 2020, CAN received $268,400 from the Canadian government's anti-racism action program. And that program is stated to be in order to fund 85 anti-racism projects that aim to remove systemic barriers faced by racialized communities, religious minorities, and Indigenous peoples. CAN also received a significant donation that was potentially hundreds of thousands of dollars from the Bank of Montreal to support social and racial justice and inclusion. So instead of fighting racism, they used this donated and government-provided money to go after individual women and our work to protect and uphold the charter-protected sex-based rights of women and girls, defaming us as hateful and anti-trans. Eva Kurlova recently wrote a piece about CAN, basically exposing them, very detailed. It's great. It's on gender dissent. It was published on September 6th. It is called How the Canadian Anti-Hate Network is Policing Thought Crime with Your Tax Dollars. So between August 18th and 24th of this year, the disclosure at the bottom of their webpage changed from our work is made possible in part to a grant from, or in part thanks to a grant from Anti-Racism Action Program, to one that says that their grant period ended in March 2022 and that they are not currently receiving any government funds. The theory is that this was changed because they were receiving a lot of criticism for being a government-funded group that was targeting feminists and just using all that money to go after people who are just speaking out about freedoms. So prior to their publication of the hit piece, CAN had emailed Away requesting comment on what they had intended to report. Their email asks for confirmation that I'm a part of WA, that we explicitly state on the website that membership is reserved for biological, and they put natal females, that the book list on the WA website includes content opposed to surrogacy, sex work, and gender diversity, and a few other things, and that we have collaborated with some other nonprofits and charities in our city. So knowing how they had gone after other women's groups in Canada, in response, we sent a cease and desist letter that was signed by WA, myself personally, Amy Ham, who you may know is currently going through a legal battle with the BC College of Nurses and Midwives for basically knowing that sex exists and matters. Those hearings start next week, by the way, and you should still be able to register to attend them. Women's Declaration International Canada signed it, and Canadian Women's Sex-Based Rights, or COSBAR, who have been frequently targeted by CON, also signed the letter, and We the Females. So that letter asserted that we stand only for the protection of women's rights and that we're not anti-trans or anti-LGBTQIA+ or anything else. Most of the other signatories had previously been defamed by both CTV, which is one of the massive broadcasters in our country, and CON as anti-trans. WDI had previously issued a response, and so did COSBAR to these pieces. In the anonymously written published piece, CON repeatedly lied, misquote, and they decontextualized both my work and the work of other women and other organizations in Canada. They use factual errors. In the piece, only 2 of them were begrudgingly corrected after publication, and one of the corrections is still wrong and contains a gendered slur. It also includes deliberate disinformation to mar women's rights activism in Canada. It was impossible to address each falsehood line by line. So instead, what I did was I produced an extensively marked up correction of the piece in its entirety. That response, the away response, can be read at bit.ly/AWAA response, all caps. So that will take you to the Google Doc where I have recreated the away response in full, and there's a link to the PDF of the corrected article. There's just so many things that are lies. So obviously it goes without saying that I emphatically deny that I am in any way hateful or anti-trans. Neither is Dr. Linda Blade or Dr. Kathleen Lowry, both of whom were named in the piece, or any other woman or organization named in the malicious and defamatory article. It's very rich that they accuse me of racism, considering that the protest that they had a problem with was regarding the federal policy, Bill C-16, that allows male offenders, including rapists, murderers, contract killers, serial pedophiles who have been described as prolific, and sex offenders to use self-ID to transfer into women's prisons across the country. This policy disproportionately impacts Indigenous women in Canada. Indigenous women represent 4% of the overall Canadian female population. They represent 40% of the incarcerated female population in Canada. And in Alberta, it is 65%. So I'm being accused of racism, and they are putting men into women's prisons, violent sex offenders into women's prisons, and granting them access to a victim pool that is largely Indigenous. And those Indigenous women are also disproportionately experiencing mental illness, addiction, and they're also disproportionately victims of physical and sexual violence. So it's obviously very troubling that CON have taken to targeting individual women as well as groups in Canada for the supposed crime of standing up for women's rights. Any groups that accomplish such incredible community work are obviously not promoting hatred in any way. CON's mandate ostensibly should protect women's rights organizations on the grounds that their members are working to uphold the rights and freedoms provided to women in the Charter on the basis of our sex. And to face discrimination from a government-funded organization is completely inappropriate, particularly if they're using funds earmarked to combat racism, a fight that women's groups support and participate in. The current Canadian government is very invested in trans activism. Our progressive leader mugs at pride. Our Justice Department has changed their definition of woman to be all people who identify as women, be they cisgender or transgender women. It is worth noting that man did not have a similar definition on that page. It has since been added and it is essentially the same. It's also worth noting that Indigenous is all people who identify as Indigenous. At the International Women's Day Summit last year, where terms like she session and she covery were patronizingly used, there were presentations that focused on the LGBTQIA plus 2S Canadians. There were also breakout chat rooms where questions could be asked of the presenters and attendees could talk to each other. Women were kicked out of the summit for asking good faith questions about whether feminism was about sex or gender, or for saying the word female. And I was personally told that the issues that people face based on their biological sex were hardly all that is important in feminism, and that it's not about female, it's about women. So the day after some of us had been kicked out of the IWD summit, the organizers, read the Government of Canada, sent an email to all of the people who signed up for the summit apologizing. That email said, in part, unfortunately and unacceptably, some attendees made the choice to post disrespectful, transphobic, and homophobic comments. We are appalled and disappointed by these posts and deeply regret that this incident occurred. So they don't go into detail about the horribly offensive things that were said, mostly the word female. But I've never had the government apologize on my behalf before. That was a weird email to get. One of the other bills that the Canadian government just pushed through is being euphemistically referred to as the conversion therapy bill. What this bill actually does is it guarantees affirmative only care for anybody who's gender non-conforming. If a therapist wanted to do the watchful waiting approach, they would be guilty of conversion therapy and subject to a lot of fallout. That bill also enshrined the word and therefore the concept cisgender in Canadian law, relegating women officially into a subset of our own sex. So for less than 100 years, we were actual people under the law. And now cisgender is part of the Canadian criminal code. So these bills that are being pushed through and that are being proposed, regardless of them being couched in racism, which is obviously horrifying, they're written so vaguely as to be applicable very widely. The second that anything passes as far as hate crime, which hate is very subjective, it is almost impossible to legislate or regulate such a thing, women are going to be targeted. There was previously a bill that would have allowed the CRTC to lift an exemption for user-generated content that essentially would have allowed women's posts to be removed from things like Facebook or YouTube or Twitter on the grounds that they did not meet the CRTC standards. So CRTC is the Canadian Radio and Telecommunications Commission, I believe. And they are the boss of broadcasting in our country. And they would have basically included all posts that are user-generated if they've been seen or monetized. That bill is still, I think, in the works, but it has been amended significantly, so that is very good. Also, in 2018, the status of women that was the previous department in the Canadian government that was concerned with, obviously, women's rights, was changed to Women and Gender Equality Canada. So it's kind of like women's studies courses in university being changed to women and gender studies, which allows the focus to be turned to the women who matter, which are the men. So that is essentially how the Canadian government is working really hard to silence feminists in Canada. And we keep fighting, and we will continue to fight. Many of us consider ourselves to be politically homeless because there isn't really a party that we can vote for that we won't be voting against our own interests. It's impossible to find a politician who is relatively reasonable, who can identify or define what a woman is. And we will just have to keep fighting and kicking and screaming as much as we need to. And the piece that Con wrote about me was called "The Hill I Am Prepared to Die On, the Fight Against Trans Women in Alberta." So despite this not being a fight about trans women in Alberta, I am absolutely willing to die on this hill. Protecting women's rights is fundamentally important, and it has to continue.